This word, joy, is a little bit loaded. It's one of the least understood words in our spiritual vocabulary, I think. And a lot of it is because of the way that we see joy, the way that we experience joy, and the things that we experience that we think are joy in our lives. We use this word about people we love. They bring us joy. We use this word about things that we like. I have a friend who has a beautiful convertible sports car, which as soon as the weather gets cold, he puts in storage. And then in the spring, at a certain point, he takes it out. It brings him joy. He would say it brings him joy. A few years ago, I participated in a survey which asked what was if I could come up with a picture of joy, what would it be? And the most often spoken answer to that question in this survey was ice cream. Now, not vanilla to me, as the picture says is vanilla. Vanilla ice cream is like incomplete to me, but fudge ripple ice cream is one of my love languages. And but sometimes people would say that something like that brings you joy. Now, I would argue that it only brings you joy for as long as you have it in front of you and as long as you don't think about the fact that you shouldn't have eaten so much, if you're me. Another a great example of joy is the joy that we get from those that we love. I had an experience just yesterday that was really interesting. I do a lot of my work in my basement office. I have an office in the basement. I play music there. I record. I write. I work on my sermons there. Most of my reference books are down there. I really enjoy being down there to do this. And my son spends a lot of time down there in the other side of the finished. It's a nicely finished basement, and he's on the other side, either on his computer or his phone or playing video games or watching TV or something like that. And very often our two dogs are down there with us. Now, I have two dogs, as I have told you before. One is about 5 years old, and he's kind of really old and lazy. I mean, he's a big German Shepherd, and that's why we don't have security system, because if you come to my door, he barks and you leave. Trust me, you leave when you hear him bark. But actually, he'd probably show you where the jewelry was if you actually met him. He's a bit of a cuddle butt. He's very nice and sweet. He just has a bark that, it really means something. So, and he's kind of old and a little bit, he just acts older than he really is. Meanwhile, I have a dog that's only 1.5 years old who is a perennial puppy. She drives him crazy. Every now and then they have a real toss-up, and I got to almost pull them apart. So yesterday I get up from my chair in the basement. My son's at the other side. They both love hanging around with them. They're both down in the basement with me. And I couldn't believe that I saw it, and nobody who knows them would believe it. So I took a picture of it. That is really what they looked like. There's one laying with her head on the older one. And they laid like that for like half an hour. They didn't move. That brought me joy. Because there was peace in there too, but there was peace between them, and it brought me joy. But I don't know that these things are what the Bible means and what our spiritual vocabulary means when we talk about joy, as much as some other things. So let's talk a little bit about what joy is not, so that we really can understand what joy is to Jesus, what joy is to God, and what joy should be to us who follow him. Some argument has been made that joy and happiness are different things. In other words, there's two different things. And the argument goes a little bit like this. Happiness is something that makes you happy, that brings you happiness. It depends on your circumstances. And something that brings you joy doesn't. Now, I will say I think there's something to this, even though there's not necessarily different biblical words for it. But I really think when you define the terms, this is really a good way to think about it. And I'll give you an example. That ice cream makes me happy. for a very short time, which is dependent on my circumstances. If I am shopping on the day before Christmas and I pull into the Kenwood Mall, because all the other malls around here are ghost towns, but if I pull into the Kenwood Mall and I find a parking spot right by the door, that's happiness, that's not joy, because it's dependent on my circumstances. You see where I'm going? I'll give you an idea of joy, and I think that to a certain extent we understand joy a little differently as parents when we become parents in a different way than we ever experience it otherwise. And what I mean to say is my son is now 16 years old. So you can figure that because he's 16 years old, we're now right in the middle of the period of his life where I don't know a thing. Okay? And he can drive me crazy sometimes. Now, not as bad as I think a lot of other people have it. I'm very proud of my son. I'm very proud. We go someplace, either a restaurant or a store, or we go out in public, and when Charles interacts with other people, Charles is more polite than any other 16-year-old I've ever seen. He just has, I'd love to tell you that we taught him this, and we did try to teach him this, but I'm telling you, some people have the spiritual gift of politeness, if you will. It seems like it comes from deep inside him, and I'm always so proud of him when I go someplace and I recognize that he's more polite than any other 16-year-old kid within 100 miles. But at 16 years old, he's designed to drive me crazy sometimes. That's how he's designed. That's how God seems to have made him. So occasionally we will just have situations where it's just like, this kid is making no sense to me. It's just not, but I'm telling you, that the joy of getting to be his father remains. Because that emotion, if you will, is not based on the circumstances. Charles can drive me crazy, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Same thing in marriage. I've been married 32 years, and you don't get to be married 32 years without driving each other crazy. But my love for my wife does not diminish when she drives me crazy or when I drive her crazy. And the joy that I have that I found someone that is such a great person to be a partner in life does not diminish, even during those times. So this idea of joy does not depend on circumstances. Unfortunately, in the modern world especially, we have another thing that we call joy that really messes us up, especially in our circumstances in 2018. It seems like it's worse than it ever has been. And this thing about us is so weird that the English language does not have a word for it. We have to borrow a word. I don't know if you understand the concept of a loan word. Every now and then there's a word that we don't even bother making a word in our language. We just borrow it from somebody else. The most famous of these is something called déjà vu. What's the English word for déjà vu? Déjà vu. We just borrow it from the French. We don't even make our own word. So the Germans, who have this wonderful way of making really long and scary sounding words, have something called, let me make sure that I get this right, Schadenfreude. And that is how it's spelled. I don't know if it has any accents or anything like that, but that's how it's spelled. Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude is the idea that my joy is based on something bad that happens to somebody else. And that is very often how we see joy in our contemporary world. Best innocuous example, because it's not always all bad. The best innocuous example was right before we started. You saw that little clip of all those scenes from slapstick comedy. It seems like the funniest comedy that you ever find involves somebody getting hit in the head with something or falling down, or very often something that we laugh at brings us the joy of laughter is because somebody else has something happen to them, And it's okay to laugh because we know it's comedy. We know that Mr. Bean doesn't really hurt himself. We know that Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin is not actually hurting themselves. And yet we laugh along at somebody else's expense. Now, I got a chance to hear about some studies that were done on this idea of schadenfreude just recently that I thought was really fascinating. Because the other place that this really rears its ugly head is the world of sports. Now, I don't like doing a lot of sports imagery and metaphors, as you know, but this is a really good one, especially this time of year that we're heading towards the football playoffs, which the Bengals will most likely not have any part in, but that's neither here nor there. Someone did a study on this, and I don't know how they did it. I never got to the details, but I found it fascinating. If there's a situation on the football field where somebody gets hurt, specifically especially it seems to happen to the quarterback, and this recently happened to a quarterback, and this was part of the study. What they were doing was they were basically watching people's behavior in the stadium, at home alone, at home with friends, and maybe in a sports bar or a restaurant where the game's on. So the quarterback gets hurt, and everybody hears in the stadium hears this cry of pain, and it gets silent. Everybody's like, "Oh my gosh, he hurt himself." Because of the immediacy, they're affected that way. However, if you're sitting at home and you're all by yourself watching the game, as a few people are, you don't have much of a reaction different than that. But if you're watching with a bunch of friends, or you're in a sports bar, the quarterback gets hurt and everybody cheers. Who's rooting for the other team? So the Bengals quarterback goes down, the Browns fans go, "Yay!" Now this has always struck me as unhealthy. Here we are cheering because someone got hurt. And it's something that seems to be built into the way that we react to things as human beings. Unfortunately, it's the exact same thinking that makes us a very divided nation politically lately. We just had an election a few weeks ago, and blue states that went red, the people that voted red were like, "Yay, those blue voters are down with blue." And meanwhile, the blue, when it went the other way, they cheered just as much at the expense of whichever team, whichever party lost in that particular election. It's like our joy is incomplete without being so opposed to whoever we oppose that we can't even communicate anymore. So this kind of thing that we call joy gets really, really dangerous. And it seems to be where it all leads so much of the time. That's not joy. And I'm so glad we borrowed a nasty sounding German word to describe it, because it's not joy. It just isn't. Any kind of joy at someone else's expense. It just isn't. So we return to the scripture today and we find out where maybe our biblical heroes find joy. Zechariah is a great example of that. As you may recall, if you've read the story recently, Zechariah is told by an angel that his wife, who's way too old to have a baby, is going to have a baby. And he says, "Yeah, right." And the angel says, "Well, because you didn't believe, you're not going to be able to speak till that baby's born." And he was mute for the rest of that time. Which must have been a bit of a difficult period. I don't know if he wrote things down or if he just put up with not being able to communicate with everybody. But when the baby is born, Zechariah gives this prophecy that you heard in our reading today. And basically, he rejoices that his son is going to be a prophet of the Most High. He rejoices in what God has done and what God is going to do. Not just what God is going to do for him and not for his enemies, but he rejoices in what God is going to do for all of humanity. It's not Schadenfreude, it's joy. His joy is really ultimately found in Jesus because Jesus is the one his son will be a prophet of. Now, this is really some serious, serious joy. But for us, we have to understand that this joy goes beyond emotions. This joy is not an emotion. I'm going to say that that's just happiness. For the Christian, in our spiritual language, joy is something different than an emotion. It's not just a reaction to something that gives us pleasure. It's not just our body's way of saying, oh, I'm so glad I found that parking space. It's actually a natural reaction to the restorative justice that God brings, to the redemption that Jesus brings, and to the love, peace, hope, and joy that our Savior brings us, that we celebrate in Advent and then at Christmas. In fact, if you look in the book of Galatians, you will find out that joy is actually one of the fruits of the Spirit. It's supernatural. The kind of joy we're talking about is supernatural. It's something that we are just going to get. So we don't get to take credit for it if it's a fruit of the Spirit. It's because the Spirit is in us. So I wanted to look at what Jesus and the Father find joy in. And there is a really interesting passage in Hebrews. Hebrews 12:2. We learn that Jesus endured the cross, ignoring the shame, for the sake of the joy that was laid out in front of him, and sat down at the right side of God's throne. I want you to understand, and I don't know that we could ever be like this. I want you to understand that Jesus found joy in his task on earth. Jesus found joy in his mission to save us, even though that was going to cost him dearly, even though that was going to cost him great pain and a death on a cross. Jesus found joy in that. When was the last time you found joy in something that was very painful or hard? I don't know that I ever have. But that's the kind of joy that Jesus found. Now, if we turn a little later in this Gospel of Luke that we read this morning, we see another idea about joy and God's vision of joy. God's vision of joy, God's true joy, is found in something that is not situational as much as missional in his mission, in God's mission, in Jesus' mission to us. And you find this in Luke chapter 15. And this will be a little bit interesting as you think about it. And I encourage you to look at Luke chapter 15 later if you want to. But Jesus has been arguing with Pharisees, religious authorities, and folks like that who just don't get it. They don't understand what God's mission is in the world. They don't understand why Jesus has come. And finally, Jesus, I think he just steps back and he thinks to himself, okay, this is really important that you get this. And if I tell you a story, you might remember it, but you might not. If I tell you this twice, you're a little more likely, but that's not enough. I'm going to tell you 3 parables to make sure you get this. I'm going to tell you 3 parables to make sure you understand what the source of God's joy is. And the first parable is a story about a lost sheep. Someone has lost a sheep, they find it, and they celebrate. All my friends, come celebrate. I found the sheep I lost. And then the next one is the lost coin. And I love this one because it looks funny to us. This person has lost a coin that is of some value and searches, under the upholstery and underneath the dog bed and everywhere in the house, in the back of the refrigerator, everywhere, finally finds this coin. Calls all their friends, "Oh, you got to come help me celebrate. I found the coin." Probably spends twice as much as the coin is worth on a celebration that they found it. And then we hear the story of the lost son. And this is a whole sermon in itself, but I'm not going to do that to you today. The lost son, where the son is lost, who represents us, and then is found. And the father can't contain his joy, has to have a celebration. God's joy is found when you and I turn to God. God's joy is found when our hearts are strangely warmed, when we are born again, when we are made new, when we are made children of God through adoption because of the work of Jesus Christ. That is what brings God joy. And what I pray as we get done with this Christmas season and then head into the normal year again, I pray that for us, that becomes our joy. When we see people who are far from God come close, may we have a share in God's joy. May we be part of God's joy. May we participate in God's joy. Not only for ourselves, but for those around us who might be far from God, who need so desperately to come close. So I'm going to leave you with a challenge. It's a little bit of a challenge for next year. I want you to, as you go about your next day or two or whatever, I want you to think about one or two people, 3 or 4, whatever, people that you know just absolutely, positively need Jesus. Write them down on a piece of paper. Maybe use that as a bookmark in your Bible or maybe as a bookmark in Our Daily Bread, if you guys use that. By the way, we have large print ones. For everybody that wants the large print ones, they came. Maybe use that there or something, someplace to remind you. And just, I don't want you to do anything fancy or you can invite them to church, sure. I mean, eventually if you want to, but that's not what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to pray as often as you can, maybe every day, for those people. And I want to say that if you can't think of 1 or 2 or 3 people that you would like to pray for, that you know need Jesus, they need a relationship with God in a way that they don't have, I suggest you expand your circle of friendship to include some of those people. Find a way to do that. We are in the world for that. Otherwise, when we got saved, when we got born again, when our hearts were strangely warmed, when we got made new in Jesus, God would have just taken us immediately. We're here on mission. So I encourage you this year, try to make a handful of people your prayer task. Try to make it your joy to pray for those people to find new life in Jesus Christ. Would you pray with me? God in heaven, your joy comes to us through the work of your Son. Your joy comes to us through what you have done and through the gift of grace that has been given to us that we do not deserve. Lord, let your love become our passion. Let us become people that love the way that you love, that speak peace and hope and love and joy to our world in a way that is conspicuous because it looks like Jesus. And everybody agreed and said, amen.